Welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison. I'm director of the Mandel Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this spotlight session on the American Jewish gap year in Israel. The mission of the Mandel Center is to develop and promote scholarship in Jewish education in order to make a deep and lasting difference on the lives of learners and the vibrancy of the Jewish community. And this session and our other events are a way of serving our mission by sharing ideas with the world, especially with Jewish educators and Jewish leaders. I encourage you to visit the center's website for more information about our various events. In our spotlight sessions, we bring together a group of really smart and well-informed people to tackle a topic within Jewish education. So, for example, in the past, we've held spotlight sessions on Machloket and on Daf Yomi and other topics. And all of those events are available for viewing on our website and our YouTube channel, and also for listening on our podcast channel. And today's event will also go up on those channels in a few days. Let me say a few words about our topic, the American Jewish Gap Year in Israel. I'm sure that the gap year is familiar to our viewers and listeners. It's incredibly common in the Orthodox world. In fact, in some modern Orthodox day schools, almost every student takes a gap, every graduating senior takes a gap year in yeshiva or seminary before going to college. But it's also familiar in more liberal settings where non-Orthodox students choose to go to a wide variety of different programs in Israel, sometimes with high school classmates, sometimes with friends from camp or youth movements. So the gap year is part of the landscape of American Jewish education. It's part of a continuum of educational experiences. It's preceded by K-12 schooling and camps and other institutions, and it's followed in most cases by college. But we don't really know that much about it. We have some research, but not a lot. We really don't know that much about why students choose to take a gap year, or for that matter, why they decide not to. We don't really know that much about their experiences on various gap year programs. We don't really know that much about the challenges that they face in these programs. And that's why we decided to bring together this group of people today to get their perspectives, not as advocates for any particular program, but as people who have a lot of experience talking to students, both during and after their participation in various programs, and as people who can help us think about what happens during the gap year and about its significance. Of course, when we planned this session last spring or summer, we didn't know that this year would turn out the way that it has. The October 7th attacks and the war have had a very significant impact on the experience of American students in Israel, just as it has had on everyone else. So we want to explore that topic as well, and we'll be sure to get to that as we proceed with the conversation. I now want to welcome our guests for today's spotlight session. First, we have Shalom Berger, who did some important early research on the gap year a number of years back, and he was the co-author of a book called Flipping Out. And Shalom now works as the director of English language programming at Herzog College in Israel. Jonathan Schwab is the director of the Office of Student Life at Yeshiva University, and he recently completed his dissertation that examined the role of the gap year in the religious growth of Orthodox men. Tilly Schemmer, until very recently, was the executive director of Hillel at the University of Michigan. She's now in a new role as the senior vice president of Wellspring at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And finally, Amy Weinreb is the Chief Executive of Education and Leadership at Masa Israel. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you. And just before we begin, I want to mention that we are conducting this session in a webinar format. So we invite your questions to us using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll keep an eye on those questions as they come in. The session is being recorded, and it will be available afterwards, as I mentioned, on the various channels on the website, YouTube channel, and on our podcast. Okay, let's get started. Let me begin by asking you your thoughts about the benefits or maybe the potential benefits of a gap year in Israel for American Jewish students. There are different programs, they're different, each program is slightly different, they have different goals and the different kinds of students, but keeping that diversity in mind, to your mind, what does it look like when a gap year goes well? Shalom, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks so much. Great to be here. I guess I should open by making clear something that you mentioned is that when I speak about this, I'm really speaking about modern Orthodox, the modern Orthodox community. That's where I did my study. That's where I taught. That's where I continue to be involved in different kinds of ways. So the kind of things that I'm going to talk about really are focused on modern Orthodox men and women who come to Israel for a year or perhaps more. Um, I guess the real question is, what do these programs hope to accomplish? And then the question is what they do accomplish. I would say that most of the modern Orthodox programs that exist in Israel, whether they are part of Israeli programs or independent English-speaking programs, probably aim for many more, but the three things that I'll mention are continued. Virtually all the students come from K through 12 day school education. They're graduates of day schools. So the hope is that they will both continue to be involved in the Jewish community, continue their Torah study both this year and beyond when they return to, most of them return to the United States. And I say most of them because another one of the goals probably has to do with the support for Israel and Zionism, which we'll talk about how that impacts in a second. And then I would say there's a more general sense of a desire to see personal growth and development. These are young people, they're impressionable. You're talking 18, 19-year-olds. This is the time in life that they are making life decisions, and this is an opportunity for them to be influenced in this kind of way. So I would say that a successful year for these kind of schools and these kind of students would be perhaps a second year, Shana Bet, as the programs talk about, and even perhaps a choice for students who do return to America as they plan. I say America to their home countries as they plan, perhaps certainly a greater commitment to be part of the Jewish community on the campuses where they are, or maybe even in some schools, not all of certainly, but in some schools, perhaps a push towards even more a more Jewish setting like the Yeshiva University or a Touro College or something like that. For some, and this is where we talked about the Zionist part, for some, it might be staying in Israel, whether in the army or in Shevet Leumi, or going to college in Israel. And you said, John, that we aren't pushing any programs. I'll mention that college in Israel is much cheaper than college in America. And there are certainly people who make choices because you can get a very fine education in one of the Israeli universities for a fraction of the cost of what there is in the States. We'll talk about some of the other things as I'm sure the conversation goes on. But I would say, well, those are some of the core values of the modern Orthodox community's program.
Yeah. So thanks, Shalom. So I think you've already mentioned some really important elements here, and I want to just highlight that some of the things you talked about. You talked about greater involvement in Torah learning and greater involvement in Jewish community. Those are, we might think about, those are not departures necessarily from the paths that the students were on. But you also mentioned that there are other elements that the programs may see as goals, and some of these programs may see as goals, which are departures, right? Which are deviations from the pre-existing path, whether that is going to a different college, whether that's making aliyah or going Shine a Bet. Those are slightly different departures because each individual program has its own set of ideas and values. Tilly, can we go to you? What are your thoughts about the potential benefits and the goals?
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that you introduced me with the two hats that I feel that I'm wearing coming into this conversation. One being the former director of University of Michigan Hillel, where we were on the receiving end of so many of these students, and the other now thinking through the lens of my role at the Shalom Hartman Institute, really thinking about the interconnectedness as I'm overseeing age 15 to 25 youth and young adults and the professionals that support them, now able to see how the gap year fits into a much broader lens, a much broader picture of Jewish education across that age spectrum and the professionals that support. But really thinking about when I would see the students who would come to us at the beginning of the year, and you could even see it, that first Shabbat dinner who was showing up on campus at the Hillel, there was something that you could really tell was different about the students who had been on gap year. Dare I say they had a little bit of a swagger. They were more sure of themselves, more grounded in their sense of identity and who they are, more sure of how they want to show up in community because they've had that experience for the year. And they're also showing up on campus having already been away from their homes, their communities, their families for a year. So while they're certainly adjusting to a new campus life and typically a new environment geographically, they're not going through the same emotional adjustment of leaving their childhood homes as so many of the other students, their peers that are starting as freshmen. I think depending on the kind of program that they went on, they're either coming to campus, and this is potentially a lot of the students that Shalom was talking about, they're either coming to campus with a strong sense of the kind of community that they're looking for. They seek that out. They find comfort and familiarity and belonging there. Or if they went on a gap year that really exposed them to much more diversity as part of its mission, diversity in Israel, diversity in Jewish peoplehood, then they're coming to campus in many ways more comfortable and eager to seek out that kind of diversity, the diversity of opinions, backgrounds, and communities that one can find in a campus environment. I find across the board, students certainly come to campus with a deeper sense of their relationship with Israel and how Israel fits in as a part of their own Jewish identity. You can tell that the students who were on programs that had a deep engagement with Israelis and that they were exposed to the diversity of Israeli society. You also have a sense that those are the students that are going to come to campus with a more sophisticated ability to engage in conversations about Israel in all of its complexity and to navigate challenging questions and moments on campus with resilience. And they seem to arrive with more agency to engage in the Israel conversation, while others who haven't done a gap year or real immersive experience in Israel, that they sort of, they don't hold that same kind of agency, and more things, they feel like they're happening to them rather than feel more engaged to be responsive to them.
Really?
I do have one comment. Is it okay?
Go ahead.
I have one comment to make. One of the different other differences that I see, and I think it's important to highlight, is that those who are coming from yeshiva or seminary experience, I'm finding that it has become more and more important for those students to already seek out and choose a college campus that they know that they're going to be able to continue the kind of learning that they received in a gap year environment. So, and I know others will probably speak to this, likely having a JLIC or Orthodox educator on campus who are going to meet those needs. But I also find that those who are coming from other programs that offer deep learning from a pluralistic or liberal Jewish lens, they're also seeking an educator to continue learning with, likely through their Hillel or others who are available locally. And I'm finding that sometimes these students who are coming from the pluralistic or liberal Jewish experiences, that they are falling between the Hillel content and the JLIC content, or potentially they don't have an educator at all on their campus that can meet them and their curiosity and their thirst for continued learning when they come to campus. And so these students sometimes feel as if their campus experience could be lacking because they can't continue the depth of Jewish education that they're looking for. So sometimes they're seeking out their old educators from their gap year program. Sometimes they're getting involved academically in interesting ways, or getting involved differently on campus. But many feel like they're missing out on that continuation of their Jewish education experience. And I hope that we're able to dive in a little bit more to that in terms of how we can think about how we're filling those gaps and seeing this as an opportunity to continue their learning more broadly.
Great. And until you start out by talking about swagger, and I think that's great. We can now introduce that term as kind of a key term for the sociology of Jewish education. We're going to be looking at swagger, and it's also really interesting just to think about the trajectory of kids. And I'm thinking about what you said about non-Orthodox kids who maybe before their gap year had a fairly narrow Jewish educational experience, their synagogue, their family, whatever it happened to be. But the gap year actually was quite broadening. And so they arrive on campus with a broader perspective of the Jewish world or opportunities that might be available to them. Great. Jonathan.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege to be here. And I feel like so much of what I wanted to say was already said so eloquently and articulately. Like Shalom, a lot of my research primarily focused on Orthodox students, certainly in my work at Yeshiva University, where the vast majority of our students come to college from a gap year, almost always on Orthodox programs. But also my dissertation research was focused on Orthodox college men who have taken that gap year, or men coming from an Orthodox background who've taken a gap year and were now in college. Although I had the privilege to study that with part of a group at NYU studying higher education and specifically religious development. So I had some wonderful colleagues and classmates who were studying Shia Muslim students, Hindu students on campus, and sort of situating the questions of religious development in those areas and those terms, and thinking how do analogous perhaps or somewhat similar populations go through similar sorts of steps or think about things, and through that came across what I think is really, really valuable research to frame this, which is Lori Peek's research on Muslim religious development. She studied Muslim college students and looked at sort of the stages they went through. And one of the transitions that she highlights, which I think is one of the key ways that I think about this, is the transition from ascribed identity to chosen identity. And that these students, hopefully at some point, and I think this is the gap year can be key to this, going from a community that these students have always been a part of, that they've always had exposure to, that they've always been told they're a member of, to choosing themselves. This is how I see myself. This is how I situate myself. So even among Orthodox students, when it's a continuation of a lot of the types of learning they've already had, there's a fundamental shift between this is something that I've always been told, go to this room, study this material, learn from this teacher, to this is something that I really am choosing to undertake on my own. And that the acquisition of that agency, I think, is incredibly important for identity development. Everything else, I think, is a question of curriculum, skills, content, like everything that's been mentioned. But the idea of immersing yourself, separating from your home and immersing yourself somewhere else, and we can talk a lot about what it means to be exclusively with a group of people, or almost exclusively with a group of people who are going through the same experience, that we're putting, students of roughly the same age, of roughly the same maturity, all together without their families, without older students, without younger students, but going through that experience, I think, and making that transition into a chosen identity, into this is who I am. I think that's swagger is such a great term for it. I think that's where that comes from, because there's an assuredness then that comes with that of I know who I am, and it's not because someone told me this is who I am. It's I know who I am because this is what I spent time really thinking. This is who I am, and this is who I want to be. That's, I think, the single biggest benefit of the gap year, and an incredibly important transition they can undergo. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about all the things that come with that or can prevent that, or challenges there. But I think that's the biggest benefit and the most important thing that happens that students undergo.
So I'm really grateful, Jonathan, you're bringing in the perspective of developmental psychology and sort of where the students are. And it's particularly notable that that students that you were able to detect students developing this sense of agency, of sort of chosen identity at this stage away from the family, even though they were in an Orthodox program, right? They were in Orthodox yeshivot. So it's not like they have gone to a non-Orthodox setting, but still there's something about the stage, the disruption of the prior educational experiences, being away from the family that really seems to pop for their development. Amy, over to you.
Yes, I feel like I have a little bit of a different perspective. I'm going to spice things up a bit. There are many things that my fellow panelists have said that I agree with, that gap, post-gap people arrive to campuses of their next stage more mature, maybe refreshed, greater perspective, independence. They're socially and emotionally more prepared to live independently, and they're more Jewishly oriented. But I do feel, and I'll just say one thing about where I'm coming from, and this is not Orthodox, modern Orthodox perspective. This is mostly students who would identify as Reform, conservative, maybe unaffiliated, maybe conservadox at the highest level. But I'm coming off of, like Tilly, kind of switching from campus to being in Israel and pushing gap students out. But while I was on campus as an instructor at the University of Texas at Austin, although all of these positive things and this emotional connection to Israel was strong for gap students upon their return, arriving in my classrooms, I want to just plant a seed, a question of doubt or a new perspective on the swagger, which is that the swagger in terms of Jewish identity in a Hillel context or Chabad context or with their Jewish friends, great. But where the swagger did not come out, and maybe I'm pushing the conversation to the next question already, is in difficult conversations in the university classrooms discussing Israel, where there might be Middle Eastern studies students or peace global studies students, or students who had a lot of facts and examples and details and artillery against Israel. And some of the gap students did not have the swagger the ability to really talk back with the same volume of information. And so I want to put forward, I don't know if it's a dichotomy, but it's two outcomes. And I would say a really successful outcome is if that gap student was socially, emotionally, and Jewishly prepared, but also ready to talk about Israel in tough campus environments. And I think that now it's harder than ever. And the other thing I'm going to mention to sort of carry the conversation forward is that there's also a tax having been a gap student in a progressive college campus, which means that you've got some Israel cooties, that you might actually have a little bit of stigma, that you're not surrounded by other Jewish students who've done the same thing. There's people who question that if you've spent a year or 10 months in Israel, then maybe there's something wrong with your moral or ethical thinking as a person. That is something very tough that we have to confront as we're recruiting and supporting and returning gap students back to North American campuses. So I'm inserting a little bit of difficulty into what the ideal outcome would be. And socially and emotionally connected is not the same as intellectually prepared for the classroom or campus environment.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate your introducing that element. which is sobering, right? Which is I think about this in terms of resilience, both emotional resilience and intellectual resilience. And this is a question not necessarily that we have the answers to, but in what ways does the gap year, along with other educational experiences, but in what ways does the gap year develop a kind of resilience that enables students to navigate all kinds of challenging situations, but including a potentially challenging situation of Israel conversations on campus. Let me turn to the next question. I framed that first question in terms of the potential benefits of the gap year. So that was we were thinking about what it looks like when it goes really well. And now I'm curious about what you might have to say about obstacles. What are the obstacles to growth and learning among gap year students? It doesn't always go as well as it might. What stands in the way of a really successful gap year experience? Jonathan, do you have a thought about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think first and foremost, just the standard obstacles of young adulthood. People and I think even more than ever, people in that 18 to 24 age, it is a hard time. Growing up is difficult. There are a lot of pains with growing up, difficulties figuring things out. There's a lot, I think, socially that's going on with friendships, romantic entanglements, and that's a really important part, like element of it. But also I think sometimes can take away from growth in other areas. Finding the right program and the right fit also. Sometimes students just really are not in the right place for them, and it's often very, very hard to judge because there's very limited firsthand view of what a program is like, what the day-to-day experience is. So there are, I think, a lot of students who wind up in a place that isn't really the best place for them, and it can be hard then to transition to somewhere else, to sort of just like tough it out, to modify or adapt yourself to what's going on. So that's certainly a difficulty. And even just being away from home, being in a different country, but not everybody is equally, as equipped to undergo that strain as easily. And then I think there are, like Amy just said so well, there are a lot of questions of just like exploration in depth versus exploration in breadth, and what it is that students are looking for, what it is that they think they want to accomplish for their next step, and whether they're pursuing that, whether they're pursuing something that might not benefit them in that way. Like if you're looking to deepen your Jewish identity, it's really hard to balance, like, what does it mean to deepen your Jewish identity in a very insular Jewish context versus deepen your Jewish identity in a way that prepares you to be Jewish in a place where you are really in the minority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
there may be a lot of obstacles and challenges.
Yeah. So there may be, I can imagine that, there can be some wonderful goals, wonderful accomplishments within the particular setting, but that setting may then not prepare the student terrifically well for what's next. Others want to jump in? Other thoughts about the obstacles?
I'll move away from John talking more from the psychological perspective. I'll talk from a very, very technical perspective. And I'm going to show my age here. When I came to Israel in 1991 and taught in one of these one-year Israel programs in BMT, for those who remember back that far, it was a total immersive environment. Students came and they were really separated from their parents and the schools they went to and their communities, to the extent, and here I'm showing my age, the parents would fax the sports pages to the students on Monday morning so that the students could find out how their favorite baseball team was going. Remember faxes? Today, everyone walks around with a cell phone. And I literally see students from the local yeshiva walk into the makolet and call their moms to find out what they should be buying. And without question, this has created a challenge. I mean, that's not even talking about the fact that today you'll watch the Super Bowl on your phone, and it's or any movie that you have Disney Plus on your phone, and anyone can walk out of the Beit Midrash, out of their studies, and take an hour and downtime and reconnect totally, utterly, and completely with American culture. And that has to change the potential impact that yeshiva or seminary experience has on a student.
I'm glad you introduced that. Right, it definitely does affect things, the sense of isolation, but also the first example you gave of calling a parent as you shop at the Makolet also changes how we think about kind of independence when you're when you're still tethered in that way. Certainly. I can imagine there's still a great deal of independence, but it looks and sounds a lot different. Others? Tilly.
It's so interesting because, Shalom, what you're referring to is the exact same as the difference between a freshman student starting out now versus 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that there's a different sense of connectedness back home, and that can make things easier and also make things harder. And it can give comfort and also make people feel less immersed in the environment that they're in. But I think that would happen regardless of whether they were in gap year or starting out their freshman year. I do think that it drastically changes that gap year experience and the sense of distance from home, certainly. I think there's just one thing that I want to comment on here, a little bit in response to Amy's comment before, and I think that and also Jonathan's comment, I think that it is critical for young people to find the program that is right for them. And it's really hard to ask somebody who's 17 to do that because they're trying to figure out their own questions that they need to ask, let alone what is the answer that they're looking for. And so I want to acknowledge that that's really challenging, but there are really diverse programs. And to consider what it is that you want to experience when you go to Israel, and who do you want to be when you're leaving Israel as well, and what is that time? What are the important interactions and questions and learning that you're doing during that time that you're being exposed to? I do think that just because a young person goes on a gap year doesn't mean that they're going to engage as a leader on campus. And there are many programs that don't consider leadership at all a part of their mission. There are others that do. And so I think that that's important for those who are thinking about that for themselves in terms of, do they want to be taking on a leadership role? I'd love to see more gap year experiences consider what are the seeds that they're planting that inspire and equip students with that desire and confidence in the tools to take on leadership roles. And I actually don't think that should only be a leadership role in terms of Israel advocacy. I think that means a leadership role in terms of the kind of community that you want to be a part of and create on campus. I think that means taking on a leadership role in terms of engaging with people who are different from you, taking on leadership roles in terms of volunteerism and social activism. Those are all things that students can be exposed to in different gap year programs. And yes, also the Israel piece. And I believe that there is an important role that gap year's program should play in helping students be able to, at the very least, talk about their Israel experience, talk about their sense of relationship with Israel. It's not a counterpoint kind of training, but really give them a sense of how are you going to show up on campus with Israel as a part of your Jewish identity now, and this experience in Israel behind you. How are you going to engage with people and bring that story and the stories of what you experienced, in particular this year, the stories of what you experienced, to a campus environment in ways that feel meaningful to you, not ways that other people expect you to do it, but ways that really feel meaningful to you and allow you to engage in community on campus.
Yeah, Tilly, I want to just build on what you're saying, and that if anything, students leaving a gap year should be familiar with their own story and be able to own it and feel like it's a narrative that's valid and that it belongs to them, that no matter where they go, they're coming with a meaningful long-term experience that only they can really explain. And that can be very empowering, whether they take a leadership position on campus or do Israel advocacy or anything else. But I'm always going to come back to different challenges, and I'm going to name a couple more. One is related to the narrative, but another one is balancing freedom and experimentation during the gap year with something safe. There's a lot of drinking. And one of the cultural benefits and sort of explosive delights of the gap year is that the drinking age in Israel is 18 instead of 21. And who takes advantage of that? It spans from actually ultra Orthodox all the way down to unaffiliated who show up at bars and experiment in this way. And it's part of the fun, but it's also part of the danger. And it's something that we all need to be really aware of. And that there's nothing that has to do with alcohol poisoning that becomes the most memorable part of the narrative, but it is something that makes, I think, I don't know how aware parents are of it, but it's something that does come up in some recruitment conversations. But the other thing about the personal narrative is something that I've heard from GAP students is like, wow, I went from being indoctrinated by my Zionist parents or in my day school, or even just being in a shul situation where there was a very strong, proud Zionist narrative, to my gap year where I was further indoctrinated and I didn't have the tools to sort apart a story that I believe to be true. And then I'm bombarded with information in an academic context that I don't know how to sort apart. But the feeling that they've been lied to and that the gap year didn't actually allow them to explore again, but explore intellectually or ask really tough political questions with madrichim or teachers or educators or tour guides who would allow that information to flow out is something that could lead to an unsuccessful gap year in terms of preparedness for afterwards.
Thanks, Amy. It's a really helpful reminder if we're thinking about again, how do we keep an eye on building this resilience, both intellectual and emotional, as we imagine students as independent agents going out into the world. I want to come back to this question of safety that you rightfully noted. Anytime you send kids at this age out and kind of lower the guardrails, whether that's to a gap year in Israel or to a college campus. I mean, you did mention that the drinking age is low in Israel, so that's another element. But I'm curious whether others have thoughts about the tension between kind of providing safe environments, making sure that these young people who are young are safe, and also giving them independence and helping them kind of navigate situations on their own. I feel like it's not radically different than what happens on a college campus, but it is distinctive in particular ways. And I'm curious whether you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's something. The legal drinking age being different in Israel isn't just like a mathematical, like it happens to be 3 years younger. I think it's reflective of the way that young people in Israel mature very differently than in America. I was on a gap year program with American students that was in the context of an Israeli Hesder yeshiva, and so it was American students and Israeli students. There's a huge difference between the life of an 18-year-old Israeli student and an 18-year-old American student, and I think that the drinking age is reflective of one piece of that, but 18-year-old Israelis have a lot more independence than 18-year-old Americans are used to, and Israeli society and culture is built that way, and I think that can be very immediately shocking to American students who probably post their gap year will have less independence in college than like still an 18-year-old Israeli would be given in their lives. So that's definitely, I think, something for people to really keep in mind, even at gap year programs that are, exclusively cater to American students, are built around an American experience. The students are still in a country that just treats 18-year-olds very, very differently. And that's a concern. Like just immediately flipping that switch to a lot more independence can have consequences for 18-year-olds.
Yeah. Others on that question?
I think on this question, I see a lot of the same as with Shalom's comments earlier. I would see a lot of the same kinds of experimentation and exposure happening in a freshman year in college. This is what happens when people leave their parents' home for the first time and have that sense of freedom. I want to switch the framework a little bit around of like safe topics, actually. And this gets to the other comment that Amy made about how people are showing up on campus, able to talk about their Israel experience. And I think that there is often a desire to stay so focused on mission and so focused on the experience in Israel with Israelis, that one thing that can sometimes be lacking is really an exposure to the diversity, the complexity, the challenges, Israel warts and all, and also a Palestinian narrative. And I think one of the most challenging things that I've seen is in my days at University of Michigan in particular, students who show up on campus and they've never been exposed to a Palestinian person sharing their story, a Palestinian narrative. And that is very shocking for a young person. And I find that those who come to us in particular from gap year programs or other longer experiences in Israel, or Jewish educational experiences at a high school level where they have been exposed to a Palestinian narrative before, they feel less shocked when they come to campus and they see things that are challenging and more interested in engaging with those who really want to engage, and more able to hold a level of groundedness and resilience when there are things that are quite extreme that they see on campus as well. So I want to encourage more of the pushing the boundaries of how people are, how young people are trusted to hold the complexity, to hold the hard conversations, to listen to hard stories of experiences, whether it's shared society or Palestinians over the Green Line. I think that will better equip them to be able to come to campus.
Yeah, thanks. I want to shift. I want to get your thoughts about motivations. So, we haven't done the systematic research on this, but you all have a lot of experience with, talking to students. So what's your sense about why we've been talking about the goals of programs. What's your sense about why students want to participate in a gap year, and also what sometimes inhibits them from participating? Tilly, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure, happy to. I think that there are a few things that students or their parents recognize in their students. One is certainly some are just feeling like they're not ready for university yet, that they have some of their own exploratory work or maturing or figuring out their interests or experiencing learning outside of the classroom that they want to achieve before they go to college or whatever experience they want to do next. I think some who do feel more grounded in who they are and what they want to explore, they come with a why rush kind of attitude, and they recognize that they're really not going to have so much of an opportunity to take an entire year of exploration like this for themselves. And these are people who I think actually come to their gap year program much more intentionally and with purpose, of what they want to explore during this time, in terms of how they want to explore their Jewish identity, their relationship with Israel, even the world. And then I think that there are some people who are just drawn to the experience and what it can offer them, like the real depth of learning that they can have during this kind of immersive experience, the depth of immersing oneself in Israel for the full cycle of a calendar year. And really the depth of taking the time out to explore these big Jewish questions that they have and big ideas that they have that they that they feel that they can do in Israel in ways that they can't do, even academically in a college environment. And I would say, and I imagine other people will get a little bit more into this, the two barriers that I see are really cost and time. This is a serious financial commitment. I know a lot of programs have subsidies that are available to them. But I think that that is a barrier, especially not being sure whether credits will transfer to a particular university, and does this create a 5-year expense for a family for their young person to go through that educational experience. And that's just a really big financial weight to hold. And I think that there is a pressure of I need to get my degree, I need to get my master's degree, I need to get out into the world. Some people feel that pressure more than others. So that idea of starting a year late or being a year behind their peers can be a real barrier to taking a chance on this.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amy.
I just wanted to add, I think that for some really hardworking, straight A students that have been thinking about their college outcomes, maybe even since middle school, the idea of being able to take a pause and just prevent burnout, or maybe they already are burnt out. And I've seen students coming into their freshman year of college without a gap year who seem so drained of energy and vitality and not really interested in this new experience. And I think that they're really good candidates to step back and do a gap year where the rhythm of time is different, where days are spent differently, where there's more time, different kinds of learning, more time outside, different kinds of social connections. And when I'm recruiting parents or college counselors, I mention how important that pause can be and how much more meaningful than a college experience can be afterwards, that the money spent on an expensive college degree will be more worth it if the student is prepared to enter. But on the flip side, I mean, yeah, the cost and time that you mentioned, Tilly, it's also the attitude towards the time. I mean, a lot of students feel like they're going to fall behind, that their muscle for learning is going to atrophy, that 1 year is going to be really magnified, and they're going to come in like an older person. And I think that is not in perspective and needs to be taken carefully in talking to students and parents about the benefits of taking that pause, and that 1 year in the big picture is going to make a big difference in their preparedness to be on campus. But it's not going to make that big of a difference in anything else. And also, we're entering another time in terms of people reassessing how important college is. And there are more mature college students or alternative college students than there were before the pandemic. Not everybody is starting immediately a year after or immediately after high school. Some people are taking a year to work or some other kind of gap.
So Amy and Tilly, I think both of you have mentioned elements of the American context, American Jewish context, which is, for the most part, firmly middle class, and where students are we know there's lots of data on this about how much pressure students feel, how much academic pressure they feel. Sometimes that can make it so that they don't want to take a gap year. They feel like they have to. One student even said to me something about a student I talked to recently who's currently on a gap year said she felt like she had invested so much of her high school career in getting into college that she felt like it was somehow giving up on that investment, even though it was only a year, right? So, but they're so embedded in this cultural context of academic achievement that the gap year is really countercultural, can be very, very countercultural, which can be a wonderful thing, right? Can be a huge bonus, a huge benefit, but can also sometimes be an obstacle. Shalom or Jonathan, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Shalom.
In the modern Orthodox world, it's really a very, very different picture. The expectation in so many of the modern Orthodox high schools is that, of course, you're going to go and spend a year in Israel. The concern that, oh, will my credits transfer? This is Jonathan one sitting at on Yeshiva University campus. So many of the students are already Yeshiva University students while they are studying in Yeshiva in Israel or seminary in Israel. And Yeshiva University, again, I'll leave this to Jonathan, does, I think, the vast majority of its recruiting in these one-year Israel programs. So it really is, there is here and there, you'll find someone who will be reluctant to send their child lest they make Aliyah or join the army, and that's something that's a concern for them. But even there, you can make sure to send your child to a program that doesn't encourage that level of Israel commitment. But I think that some of the concerns that Amy and Tilly mentioned, really in the modern Orthodox world, are almost non-existent.
I agreed. I think that it just interesting, John, what you mentioned of a student using this, like, I've invested so much in education, and this very culturally, this is how we think about education in America, is using the terms of business, and the gap year is never going to deliver on those, measurable metrics in the same way. You're not going to, I know we do give credit for a year of study in Yeshiva University, but you're not going to have grades or credits or those same sorts of measurable academic outcomes, which isn't to say that the outcomes are, like, the benefits we spoke about at the beginning, I think, are incredibly valuable, but it's not the way that we typically think about education in America. And I think therefore it's very countercultural, and it's often very hard for people to make that decision. In terms of motivations, I think that students very often are looking for something, certainly in the Orthodox context, looking for something, thinking about this idea of chosen, like thinking, what am I choosing? Looking for something like an identity anchor. My local synagogue, my high school, that's where my parents chose to send me. That's where my community is. But this is something that I really am choosing for myself and see myself as part of. And in my research, I came across a lot of students who, even several years after the gap year experience, very much see themselves as a product of that 1 year or sometimes 2 years, and identify with it so much more strongly than the elementary school they spent 8 years in, or the high school they spent 4 years in, or the synagogue that they prayed in for 20 years. And there's something very, very powerful about that. I'm always baffled at Yeshiva University by the extent to which students strongly identify with this or that gap year program, which in any other context would be seen as virtually identical. Like, the differences between them are tiny, but students see themselves as, I'm this type of student and not that type of student. And I think that there's a flip side to what Shalom mentioned earlier of how technology has changed isolation during the year in Israel. It has allowed students to maintain a lot of connection with their gap year experiences afterwards. Even, I was on a gap year program more recently, in the early 2000s. But following that, when I first started college, we did not have things like WhatsApp groups. And that is a huge deal. Like, I spoke with so many students who said they really feel like their strongest community is the people they went on their gap year program with, who are all now on different campuses, but they speak very often by texting each other, by being in the same WhatsApp group, that there's really a strong sense of connection. And what unifies them is they spent a year together 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but they're still so much more closely connected than the people they share a campus with.
That's really interesting. And thinking about the kind of follow-up effects of the program, when I have had the chance to talk to gap year students, invariably when I ask them about the best part of their experience, they talk about their peers, they talk about the social group. It's a very, it's a very intense, immersive experience, and that makes a lot of sense. And then you're pointing out that carries forward, right? That moves forward. Tilly, you gonna jump in on that?
I wanted to I say that I absolutely see exactly what you're saying, Jonathan, and see, I would go into the Beit Midrash at University of Michigan Hillel and see somebody on a Zoom with students from across the country and one of their educators back in their yeshiva or their gap year program at home. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about thinking about how we're using technology to continue that experience. One thing that I wanted to say that's a little bit different is that I'm actually seeing that there's a shifting landscape happening on North American college campuses of where there is a larger number of really active modern Orthodox conservative students. And that is related to the leniency of the university itself in terms of allowing students to defer for a year. And it is becoming much more commonplace for students to share these stories and for guidance counselors to be aware of this and to direct students towards particular campuses where their universities will be more accepting of them taking that gap year program. And we're seeing the impact on Jewish life in those spaces. So I saw it at University of Michigan, absolutely. And I think that we benefited from a lot of students who came from a gap year program. We're seeing at WashU a rise of students who are alumni from various pluralistic and Orthodox gap year programs. And it's just interesting to see how the students who have had those experiences are now impacting where students go and what does Jewish life look like in across the North American landscape of universities.
Thank you. I want to turn, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to turn to the question. There've been some wonderful questions that we won't have time to get to. One of our a member of our audience is curious about we've talked a little bit about independence and agency that students develop, but of course there is also peer influence. There are also sometimes very, very significant influential educators. So that's a really fascinating topic to explore, which not sure we're going to get to. There's also a question about the relationship between, again, the gap year is embedded in a larger ecosystem, and one of the elements of that ecosystem are sleepaway camps, summer camps, which are likewise, very immersive. They create incredibly strong peer bonds, and there's a question about the relationship there as well. But the question I want to turn to is about this year in particular, because obviously this has been a unique one for American Jewish students in Israel, as for all Israelis, as for all of us. And so I'm curious what you have seen or heard about experiences this year, and what you think the implications of that are, if any. Amy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this has been a really unusual, memorable, difficult, but ultimately successful year for Masa, the organization that I work for. And we made the kind of unusual decision by North American standards not to close any programs at all. We were just going to keep running as normal. This is a full immersion experience. Parents are allowed to fly their kids home, but we don't have any red lines. And the result was, I think, something mostly really amazing, which is that the gap year students who chose to stay, or their parents agreed that they could stay, are not going to be part of just like the history of October 7th and the surrounding months, but they have memories of it. They are actually here. And, some of them were in Tel Aviv, hearing siren after siren. Some of them who are more observant didn't realize what was happening when they were actually in shul at the time. And they immediately started volunteering. And for the people who stayed, they're saying this is one of the formative experiences of my life. So ultimately, I was really glad, even though it's been a real hassle in terms of security checks, 48 hours before, 24 hours before, 12 hours before, anywhere we're going, sometimes canceling if we're going to a site that's not safe. But mostly things have gotten back to sort of an emergency routine normal. And I think by around December, January, most of our programs looked sort of like they did before the war broke out. And the other thing is that I think a lot of the GAP students were really hungry for more information in an organic way. They wanted to have more Israel education. They wanted to learn more about the context of the conflict, how it erupted into a war, what Hamas was. And we had a team of Israel educators who were actually working overtime during those early days to have sessions in bomb shelters to explain with maps a little bit more what had happened and what's not predictable. But to turn towards volunteering is what's really made this meaningful. And we have a complete volunteer track now that didn't exist before the war. And we think that it's actually going to continue beyond this academic year.
Yeah, I definitely heard. Go ahead, Tilly.
I just want to say that really is the experience that I've heard from this year, and I don't have the University of Michigan hat now. I definitely have the experience from Shalom Hartman Institute and the Chavruta Gap Year program, and it has been just such a powerful experience. And just like every other Israeli, our students have their story of where they were on October 7th and how life changed for them, and that's where I am very hopeful about those students coming to campus next year and being able to really bring that story with them. We've seen them, we saw the shift to volunteering. We saw the Institute really come alive with embracing refugee families and supporting with really wonderful festive days within the Machon, where they were turning it into really a jamboree and a space for young families, that the students were deeply involved in helping to plan and deliver that. And they all volunteer. It was already a part of the program. They're volunteering even more. They were already connected with inspiring stories of social activism and civic leadership. Even more so now, they feel like they've been exposed to that in a time where we've really seen Israeli civil society step up and lead. The two other things that I'll note, one is that we are seeing students talk more about Aliyah, whether it's now or after. And I think that has to do with feeling deeply connected with Israeli society and Israelis and how Israelis were impacted in this time. And in the Chavruta program, they're seeing the Israelis that they are learning with be called up for their reserve duty early. And that is having a very profound impact on them and how they're seeing people who are their age, who are their close friends, now be called to defend the country. And that is part of the story that they're taking. The last thing that I'm seeing is that there seems to be a split between those students who feel that coming back to campus, that they're coming with an eagerness to bring that story, to bring that experience, to bring that activism to campus, and another group of students that are feeling in many ways turned off by the stories of extremism they're hearing in a campus environment. And so that's really interesting that they're experiencing what many high school students are experiencing and watching the news of campus, of whether they feel eager to be a part of that and bring their story there, or whether they feel anxious about being a part of that and bringing their story there. My feeling is that many of them will feel, once they finish their year, a stronger sense of groundedness in their sense of identity, who they are, how they're showing up with their Israel story. And I feel like they will engage much more on campus next year.
Tilly, I just want to say that when you were mentioning the different volunteering experiences, one thing that really needs to be inserted is the agricultural volunteering, which is so different. Yeah. I mean, sometimes hours outdoors in the fields, making a very tangible physical difference, picking tomatoes or avocados or citrus that wasn't part of the itinerary at all, but has become really an imprint of this year and actually helping. I mean, a lot of that produce would have gone to waste without volunteers, and it's sort of a rare experience for someone in their teenage years to feel something that they've made a difference that's so direct.
Amy, it feels like it's a callback to agricultural Zionism, right? Real pioneer Zionism, and they're having like a little bit of a taste of it in a really interesting way, very unique to this particular year of gap year students.
Yeah. So I will say that in the conversations that I had a few weeks ago in Israel, I heard from students, it wasn't necessarily a representative sample, but I'd certainly heard a great deal of gratitude that they had this opportunity to be in Israel, to have a kind of profound experience, that they recognize is unusual. And even though they were trying to figure it out, and weren't necessarily sure on what it all meant. I want to turn to a question now. I'm going to ask each of you to kind of give some final reflections about outcomes. And I'd like to hear what, in your view, what we know and also what we wonder about the growth of gap year students. In what ways do they benefit from this experience, in spiritually or intellectually or emotionally or other ways? Shalom, do you want to lead us off?
Well, you're dredging up my doctoral study from 30 years ago, whose results certainly would be different today. And every so often, I think to myself, I should give out the same questionnaire now that I gave out 30 years ago, which would be wouldn't say so much about Israel study, but as it would about sociology in general and how the Jewish community has changed, the modern Orthodox Jewish community. But I think that some of my findings, I think, are still correct. I think that students who come, and this has been what everyone has been saying about. Tilly talked about seeing students who are still in contact with their teachers in Israel, and Jonathan talked about that on the Yeshiva University campus. There is. My study found that students really were more engaged. They really were more committed to a continued Torah study. They were more committed to the Jewish community. In the Orthodox world, they were more committed to Shmirat Mitzvot, to keeping commandments. What at the time, one of the things that was an out of the ordinary finding, everything seemed to shoot up after a year of study, and certainly after the 2 years of study for those students who stayed Shana Bet. One thing that did not change at all were interpersonal kinds of things. I asked questions about giving tzedakah, charity. I asked questions about, we just talked about volunteering for the community and those kind of things. And there was really no change. And in talking to students afterwards, students said, well, this is a year about me. As long as I was back at home, I had to help at the house. I had to help take care of my younger siblings. I had the school had me doing volunteer kind of things, and I come to Israel. I go to yeshiva seminary, and it's about me. I shared that at the time. Again, this is 30 years ago, and I would like to believe. I don't want to take credit for it, but I would like to believe that today many of these programs now make some of those volunteer opportunities part of the program. In a number of the schools, they have started programs for special needs students who are mainstream, which certainly changes the environment and the sensitivity of students to people who are different than them. So some of those kind of things have taken place over the years. I would say the question always is, well, how does this, what's the long-term impact? It's very nice that we did a study that the kids come back and students come back, and yes, they go to college campuses and they perhaps are more willing to take. There was discussion of leadership. There was the discussion of leadership as far as Israel is concerned, as far as Jewish community is concerned, in general leadership. How is this a lifetime change, or is it a short-term change? Some of the things that have happened over, again, given that I did my study so long ago, in the modern Orthodox Jewish community over the years would indicate to me that maybe not for every individual student, but for on a community level, that change does hold over the long term, in the sense that I think in many day schools, parents who are now involved, who themselves studied, have greater expectations of the level of Jewish studies that exist in those schools. I know someone's going to say to me, and how about Hebrew language? No, it doesn't work for Hebrew language. Don't know why, but no one learns Hebrew. 12 years of day school education
It's a huge problem.
So Shalom, you've mentioned
Yes.
A good framing, which is not only to think about individuals, but also think about, well, what happens when a whole community invests pretty significantly and it becomes a communal norm, and how does that shift over time? I also want to just call attention to the kind of the trajectory of students. They're not stable, right? None of us is fixed. These things ebb and flow, and there's a really interesting some really interesting work to be done. Actually, a colleague is thinking about doing exactly this to follow students over time, over the course of college, right? To think about that trajectory. I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to make sure that we give each of you the last word. So, Jonathan, your thoughts about outcomes?
Yeah, I think just on that last point, I think that it's really important to note that you're totally right, and I think all of us know this, that they're not totally stable. That is often really not seen or appreciated by students coming out of the gap year. And I think one of the biggest challenges they have is that they very often think, if they've undergone some sort of a identity development transformation, that they think, okay, this is now who I am. And if I oversold it at the beginning, this is an incredibly important part of their identity development, there's then a looming crisis of what happens when part of that doesn't seem to continue carrying forward. What happens when part of what I'm committed to or how I see myself doesn't seem to be the case in college? And that, I think, is another opportunity for an even more important identity development. But that's really, really, really hard. And students coming out of gap year programs, and this isn't a criticism of the program, but the students do not seem well prepared for that. They don't seem like they are anticipating that in any way. And it seems like it really is a major identity crisis when they encounter it. And I think that's definitely an area, in thinking about it, an area of focus for study and an area of focus for thinking about how we scaffold students educationally for that.
Right. So that they don't, it's not a binary that somehow they become failures
Exactly.
in their own eyes.
And that does have, like, I interviewed a lot of students, I think, who have that, see things in that binary. I committed to doing this. Once I missed it, once I missed group prayer that first day, I never went back again, because that's, I thought I was this and I'm not that anymore, and I couldn't do it. So just being able to live with a little more complexity would be great.
Tilly?
I have a lot of empathy for what you're sharing, Jonathan, and it connects to one of the things that I'd like to see more in the, if we look at the full trajectory from high school to the gap year experience to the college experience. I want to think more about that handoff from one place to another. I think that we can do a lot more. I'm glad Amy's on this call with Ms. Sass, so we can continue the conversation, but I really do think that there is more that we can do, that we hold a sense of responsibility to these young people as we're carrying them through this Jewish journey of Jewish education and relationship with Israel, and sense of who they are and their Jewish identity and their connection to Jewish community. That there's more that we can do as institutions, as professionals, to hand them off from one to the other, to talk about strengths, challenges, what people are looking for, and to really be thinking with young people about how to help them from that high school level, find the right program for them that's going to meet their needs, think about the right campus where they're going to land that is able to hold them and is able to offer them what they're looking for at their next step. And again, as they continue on, really thinking about what are the opportunities post-college for leadership, Ultimately, I think that a lot of these young people who are going on these gap year programs, they're making this choice for a reason, that they want to show up as a part of their Jewish community and Jewish peoplehood in this moment. And there's a spark there about who they have the potential of continuing to be down the road. And I think that there's a lot of work for us to do in thinking about them as individuals on a journey, that we are supporting them towards the right leadership, the right next step, and the right leadership roles for them down the road in the future.
Thanks, Tilly. And Amy, last word.
Mine's going to be short, but it links the individual to the collective. As I walk out of my office, there's a sign that I actually really believe in. I didn't put it up myself, but it says, "Your journey is part of our collective story." And I think that's an important message for all GAP students, that in coming to Israel, they're joining part of a larger narrative, and it's life-changing for them individually, personally, but they're also becoming part of the Jewish peoplehood at a different level for having spent so much time in Israel. And I'll end with that.
Thank you. Really, I'm particularly, thank you all. I'm particularly pleased in all of the ways that we've been thinking about the location of the gap year within the ecosystem, right? The way that students, what they bring, to the gap year, then where they end up after the gap year, which is a complicated story. And I'm really grateful that you have helped to shed some light on it this afternoon. Our next event I'm delighted to say, is a book launch with our colleague Ziva Hassenfeld, who has published The Second Conversation, Interpretive Authority in the Classroom, which is all about the teaching of Tanakh. That event is happening on March 13th. It's actually a hybrid event. If you're around, we'd love to see you in person here at Brandeis, but it will also be on Zoom. So keep an eye out for that. Please remember to sign up for our mailing list, to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn and all those things. Thank you to my colleagues, Shalom, Jonathan, Tilly, Amy, for this conversation about the gap year. I really appreciate your contributions. Thank you all for joining us, and take care.